The moment my son-in-law pulled out my chair and I hit the marble floor, his words echoed louder than the laughter. "Your place is on the floor!" I just stayed down for a second, catching my breath and looking at my daughter's face. But when his father stepped forward and wrapped his arms around me, the atmosphere snapped. I knew in that instant her perfect wedding was only minutes away from becoming a public spectacle. Now, before I share what happened next, I'd be grateful if you'd consider giving it a thumbs up. The Marriott downtown ballroom sparkled with fairy lights and white roses, the kind of elegant setup that cost more than most people's cars. I'd been making my way to the family table, navigating between clusters of guests who were already 3 drinks deep into the reception. The chair with my name card sat empty at the head table, right where a father should be during his daughter's wedding. My knee was acting up from an old tennis injury, and I was looking forward to finally sitting down after the long ceremony and photo session. Brandon stood behind my chair, all smiles and perfect teeth, playing the gracious host. "Let me get that for you, sir," he'd said, his hand on the chair back. The word "sir" dripped with something I couldn't quite place until later. I nodded my thanks and began lowering myself down, my weight already shifting forward, when he yanked the chair back with practiced precision. My body had already committed to the descent. Muscles relaxed in anticipation of support that suddenly wasn't there. The fall seemed to happen in slow motion, my arms flailing uselessly as I tried to catch myself on the tablecloth, which only sent champagne flutes and centerpieces scattering. The impact knocked the wind out of me, my hip taking the brunt of it against the polished marble floor. For a moment I couldn't hear anything except the ringing in my ears and my own ragged breathing. Then Brandon's voice cut through the fog, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Your place is on the floor!" The laughter started as nervous titters, then spread like wildfire when people realized the groom himself was laughing the hardest. From my position on the ground, I had a perfect view of designer shoes and cocktail dresses, everyone towering above me like I was something they'd stepped in. My daughter Sarah's face appeared in my field of vision for just a moment, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. It wasn't shock, or concern, or even embarrassment. She looked conflicted, torn between rushing to help and maintaining some kind of distance. Then she turned away, her wedding dress swirling around her like armor, and I caught her grabbing Brandon's wrist, her knuckles white. The photographer was still snapping pictures, probably thinking this was some kind of planned entertainment. My hands pressed against the cold floor, feeling every eye in that ballroom boring into me, waiting to see what the old man would do next. But I didn't get up right away. I stayed there, letting the moment stretch out, because in that position I could see things more clearly than I had in months. The way Brandon's college buddies were filming with their phones, already posting to whatever social media would get them the most views. The way the bridesmaids clustered together, not one of them moving to help. The way my ex-wife sat at her table with her new husband, shaking her head like this confirmed every criticism she'd ever had about me. The room felt electric with anticipation, everyone waiting for the next act in this unexpected drama. When I finally pushed myself up, my hip screaming in protest, Brandon was right there with a napkin, making a big show of brushing off my rented tux. "Careful there, old-timer," he said, just quiet enough that only those closest could hear. "These floors can be pretty slippery when you've had too much to drink." I hadn't touched a drop all day, and he knew it. The smell of his cologne was overwhelming, some expensive brand that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. I straightened my jacket, fixed my tie, and looked him dead in the eye. Something flickered across his face then, just for a second. Not quite fear, but maybe the first hint that his little stunt might have consequences. The band leader, professional enough to recognize a crisis, struck up a loud, jazzy number that got people moving toward the dance floor. The moment was passing, dissolving into a normal wedding reception. But I caught something else as I turned to find another seat. There was movement in the crowd, a disturbance in the carefully orchestrated flow of the reception. Sarah had disappeared into the bridal suite. Brandon following after exchanging words with his groomsmen that made them laugh uncomfortably. As I limped toward the bar, needing ice for my hip more than a drink, I noticed how the room had split into camps, some guests whispering about what they'd witnessed, others determinedly pretending nothing had happened. I looked down at the table where I'd fallen. The napkin Brandon had used to help me lay crumpled in my fist, damp with champagne, and something that might have been blood from my lip. My place card with my name in elegant calligraphy had slipped from its holder. I righted it, but it slid face down again, as if it knew better than to claim a place at this table. 6 months earlier, I'd met Brandon for the first time at Capitol Grill, the kind of steakhouse where they don't put prices on the ladies' menus. Sarah had been dating him for 3 months before she decided I was worthy of an introduction. She'd picked the restaurant, or so I thought at the time. The mahogany panels and leather chairs screamed old money, and Brandon looked right at home, already seated when we arrived, working on what looked like his second martini. He stood when he saw us, all 6 feet 2 inches of him, with that salesman's smile that never quite reached his eyes. "You must be the famous father I've heard so much about," he said, his handshake just a little too firm, held just a little too long. The way he said famous had an edge to it, like being known by your daughter was somehow amusing. She beamed beside him, but it was different from her usual smile, tighter, like she was holding her breath waiting for something. She kept glancing at Brandon before she spoke, these little checks for approval that I'd never seen her do before. When the waiter came, Brandon ordered a bottle of wine without looking at the list, rattling off some French name that meant nothing to me but clearly impressed the sommelier. "The 2015 is drinking beautifully right now," the waiter said, and Brandon nodded like they were old friends discussing the weather. 2015 or $2,000, I wondered, but didn't ask. Sarah barely touched her glass when it came, just held it like a prop, while Brandon launched into stories about his work in investment management. The details were always fuzzy, lost in a cloud of technical terms and name-dropping. Seattle this, Hong Kong that. Deals worth more money than most people see in a lifetime. But when I asked specific questions about which firm, which clients, his answers got vaguer, sliding sideways into other stories. The food came in waves, each plate more elaborate than the last, things Brandon had ordered for the table without asking what we wanted. Oysters from some specific bay in Maine, Wagyu beef that cost more per ounce than gold, truffle everything. "I hope you don't mind," he said, cutting into his steak. "I took the liberty of ordering the chef's best. You strike me as more of a burger and fries guy, but I figured tonight called for something special." The way he said burger and fries guy made it sound like a character flaw, something to be corrected rather than a preference. Sarah laughed at all his stories, but it was hollow, performative. When she tried to tell one of her own, about a project at the museum where she worked, Brandon cut her off mid-sentence. "They don't want to hear about your little art thing, honey," he said, patting her hand like she was a child who'd interrupted the adults. "Tell them about the trip to Aspen instead." She did, but the light had gone out of her eyes. This wasn't my daughter, the one who could talk for hours about restoration techniques and had opinions about everything. This was someone playing a part, and not very convincingly. When the check came, Brandon made a big show of patting his pockets, then gave an embarrassed laugh that didn't sound embarrassed at all. "Would you believe I left my wallet in the Tesla?" he said, already standing up. "I'll run out and grab it unless—" He let the word hang there, looking at me expectantly. Sarah's face went red, her fingers twisting her napkin into knots. "Dad doesn't mind," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Right, Dad? What was I going to do? Make a scene?" I handed over my credit card, watching Brandon's satisfied smirk as the waiter walked away. $2,000 the wine had been, plus everything else. That became the pattern over the next few months. Dinners where Brandon would forget his wallet, or his card would mysteriously be declined, or he'd promise to get the next one. But the next one never came. Sarah grew quieter with each meeting, like she was slowly disappearing into Brandon's shadow. When I tried to talk to her alone about it, she'd get defensive, almost angry. "You just don't understand him," she'd say. "These things don't matter to him like they do to you." But they mattered. Every slight, every dismissive comment, every time he called me sport or chief, like I was some retired janitor he was humoring. 3 weeks before the wedding, I got an email from the wedding planner, someone Brandon had insisted on hiring despite my offer to help plan it ourselves. The message was cheerful, but firm. The final payment of $30,000 was due immediately. "Brandon mentioned you'd be handling all the finances," she wrote, "given the situation with the divorce and what you owe your daughter." I read that line 5 times, my coffee growing cold in my hand. I'd never discussed the divorce with Brandon, never mentioned any debt because there wasn't one. My ex-wife and I had split everything fairly, including the college funds. But Brandon had been telling people a different story, painting me as the deadbeat dad making amends with his checkbook. I tried calling my daughter, but she didn't answer. When I finally reached her that evening, she sounded tired, defeated almost. "Just pay it, Dad. Please. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Brandon says his assets are all tied up in investments right now. It's complicated. Everything with Brandon was complicated, except spending my money. That seemed to come very easily to him. I could hear him in the background, saying something about how real men take care of their families, loud enough to make sure I heard it." She hung up quickly after that, another pattern that had developed since Brandon came into the picture. 2 weeks before the wedding, I drove out to the Marriott to check on the arrangements one last time. Sarah was supposed to meet me there, but she texted at the last minute saying Brandon would handle it. The wedding coordinator, a brittle woman with a tablet permanently attached to her hand, walked me through what should have been familiar plans. Except nothing was familiar. The intimate garden ceremony my daughter had wanted was now a grand ballroom affair. The string quartet she'd carefully selected had been replaced with a DJ Brandon knew from college. Even the menu had changed from the elegant salmon and chicken options to some fusion nonsense that cost 3 times as much. "Mr. Mitchell approved all these changes last week," the coordinator said when she saw my confusion, her manicured finger swiping through digital invoices. "He said you were old-fashioned and wouldn't understand the modern touches they wanted." She said it with a little smile, like she was in on some joke I wasn't sophisticated enough to get. Every change added thousands to the bill, all of it somehow already charged to my credit card they had on file. When I tried to object, to say my daughter hadn't mentioned any of this, the coordinator's smile turned condescending. "Mr. Mitchell said you might have some resistance. He mentioned the divorce, how hard it's been, how this is her chance to have the wedding she really deserves." That evening was the rehearsal dinner at Brandon's country club, another place where the walls were lined with dead animals and old white men's portraits. Brandon had insisted on hosting it, then sent me the bill anyway. The private dining room overlooked the golf course, sunset turning everything golden in that fake way rich people seemed to prefer over actual nature. Brandon stood at the head table, champagne glass catching the light, ready to make his toast. Behind him was an empty chair with a white rose on it, supposedly for my daughter's grandmother who'd passed 5 years ago. But the way Brandon kept gesturing toward it during his speech made it feel like something else entirely. "We all have our proper places in life," he said, his voice carrying that preacher's cadence that made my skin crawl. "Some people understand that, and some people need to be reminded. We're building a future together, one that honors the present while leaving the past where it belongs." He looked directly at me when he said past, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To knowing your place, and to those wise enough to step aside when their time has passed." The room applauded politely, but I caught the uncomfortable shifts, the worried glances. Sarah stared at her plate, her hands folded so tight her knuckles were white. This wasn't a toast to their marriage. It was a declaration of war, and everyone knew it. Later on the terrace, The maid of honor found me while everyone was mingling over cocktails. She'd been my daughter's friend since middle school, practically lived at our house during high school. If anyone would tell me the truth, it would be her. "Something's really wrong here," she said, keeping her voice low. "She's not herself. She hasn't been since she met him." She kept glancing around like she was afraid of being overheard. Sometimes his stories feel rehearsed. A hair too smooth, like he's memorized a part. And the wedding license. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What about the license?" I asked. She bit her lip. I convinced her to wait. "Humor me," I told her. "File the license after the weekend." She nodded, uneasy for reasons she couldn't name. "I don't know what it is, but something about Brandon makes my skin crawl." Before she could say more, Brandon appeared in the doorway, his timing too perfect to be coincidental. He'd been watching us, maybe listening, his presence a reminder that walls have ears in places like this. "Your friend is looking for you," he said to the maid of honor. "Something about the bachelorette party plans." It wasn't a suggestion. She squeezed my hand before leaving, a silent message of support that felt like the only genuine thing in this whole orchestrated event. Brandon waited until she was gone, then moved closer, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath mixing with that expensive cologne. There was something practiced about his intimidation, like he'd done this dance before with other fathers, other families he'd invaded. "You know," he said, using my first name like we were old friends, "your daughter told me all about the divorce. How hard it was on her. How absent you were, building your little business while her mother raised her alone." None of it was true, but he said it with such conviction I almost wondered if I was remembering wrong. She deserves this wedding, this life, and if you really loved her, you'd stop making it about you. He patted my shoulder, the gesture somewhere between condescension and threat. "The chair thing at the reception? That's for real family, the people who'll be there for her future, not relics from her past." The drive home that night felt longer than usual, my mind churning over the maid of honor's observations. Something about Brandon's manner, the way he held his wine glass with that particular three-finger grip they teach at certain business schools. It nagged at me. I'd seen that grip before, in conference rooms and cocktail parties, back when I was building my company. It was such a specific thing, muscle memory from another life. But Brandon claimed he'd never worked in traditional corporate settings, said he'd always been an entrepreneur. The inconsistencies were piling up like unpaid bills, each one small but collectively overwhelming. I couldn't shake the image from the rehearsal dinner. That empty chair with the white rose, Brandon's hand resting on its back as he talked about knowing your place. The way he'd looked at me when he said it, like a chess player who'd already seen checkmate 10 moves ahead. Now, alone in my kitchen, I pulled out my own dining chair and sat down heavily. At least this one stayed where it belonged. The morning of the wedding arrived, gray and humid. The kind of December day in Atlanta that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain or just make everyone miserable with anticipation. I stood in my hotel room at the Marriott, adjusting my bow tie for the 5th time, when something about the mirror's reflection caught my eye. My hands, the way I was holding the tie, it triggered something. A memory from years ago, fuzzy at first, then sharpening like a photograph developing in solution. Someone else used to adjust their tie the same way, with that nervous 3-tug pattern. But who? The thought gnawed at me as I made my way downstairs. The hotel was buzzing with wedding preparation, florists and photographers and Brandon's groomsmen all moving with practiced efficiency. I stopped by the concierge desk. An impulse decision. "Strange question," I said to the young woman behind the counter. "But do you keep records of past events here? Corporate conferences from, say, 10 years ago?" She looked puzzled, but pulled up her computer. "We do have some archived information. What specifically are you looking for?" I wasn't sure, but I gave her the dates when my old company used to hold our annual meetings here. She found something, her eyes widening slightly. "Oh, this is interesting. There was an incident report filed during your company's conference in 2014. Something about an employee being escorted out." My pulse quickened. Brad Miller. That was the name that had been dancing at the edge of my memory. Young analyst, bright kid from University of Washington, hired straight into our investment firm. We'd caught him moving money, small amounts at first, testing the system. The three-finger wine grip, the nervous tie adjustment, the way he'd blamed everyone but himself when confronted. The details cascaded back, but the face remained frustratingly vague. I called my old business partner from the lobby, stepping outside where the wedding guests couldn't hear. Odd question. Do you remember what Brad Miller looked like? The analyst we terminated for fraud? The pause on the other end was long. Funny you should ask. Someone called about him a few months ago, said they were doing a background check. I told them what I could legally say, which wasn't much. Why? I described Brandon, but physical descriptions over the phone are like trying to explain a song with words. Be careful, my partner said slowly. After we fired Miller, there were rumors, identity changes, more attempts at other firms. Some people, when they get caught, they learn to be better people. Others just learn to be better criminals. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk about Brandon. I have information you need. Lobby bar, 10 minutes. No signature, but something about the formal tone, the way need was repeated, felt familiar. Corporate speak from someone used to giving directives. I made my way to the bar, finding an older man sitting alone, his gray suit expensive but understated. When he turned, recognition hit like cold water. The former CFO of my company, the man who'd helped me build it from nothing. He'd left shortly after the Miller incident for what he'd called personal reasons. Hello, he said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for a wedding day. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. He gestured to the seat beside him, and I noticed his hands were shaking slightly. I've been trying to find the right way to tell you this for weeks, ever since I saw the wedding announcement. He pulled out his phone, showing me a photograph from 10 years ago. Our company holiday party, a group shot of the senior staff and analysts. There in the corner, younger, thinner, with different hair, was Brad Miller. But the bone structure, the eyes, they were Brandon's. That's not possible, I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I knew it was. The older man's face crumpled slightly. Brad Miller is my son, my estranged son. After you fired him, I helped him disappear, paid for therapy, tried to get him help. I thought he'd changed, thought he'd built a legitimate life as Brandon Mitchell. Mitchell is my last name. Brandon was his middle name. Brandon Miller became Brandon Mitchell. The weight of it, the betrayal within betrayal, was staggering. This man had been my friend, my trusted CFO, and he'd hidden this connection all these years. I've been tracking him, he continued, his voice breaking slightly. Not constantly, but enough to know he's been running variations of the same con, targeting successful men he feels wronged him through their daughters. He pulled out his phone again, showed me just 3 things. A photo from 10 years ago where Brad looked younger but unmistakable. A note in Brad's handwriting that said, Thompson will pay. And a calendar with dates circled that matched my daughter's relationship timeline. Not a dossier, just pieces I couldn't ignore anymore. When I saw your daughter's photo, your name, I knew I had to act. But I'm still his father. I kept hoping he'd stop on his own, that this would be different. He's planning something for the reception, I said, remembering the maid of honor's warning. Something about a chair, about putting me in my place. The older man nodded grimly. That sounds like Brad. He needs the victory to be public, witnessed. It's not enough to win. Everyone has to see him winning. It's his pathology, the need to prove he's better than the people who rejected him. We sat in silence for a moment. 2 fathers on opposite sides of the same tragedy. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I don't have all the answers. I don't even have all the evidence. But together, maybe we can stop this before it goes too far. I want to protect my daughter, I said. Everything else is secondary. He nodded slowly. I'll stay close during the reception, hidden but ready. If Brad goes through with whatever he's planning, I'll intervene. He won't expect me. He thinks I'm in Singapore on business. It wasn't much of a plan, more of a hope, but it was all we had. We agreed on signals, contingencies, the kind of planning we used to do for board meetings when hostile takeovers were threatened. But this time the stakes were personal. My phone rang. Sarah. Dad, where are you? The photographer wants family photos before the ceremony. Her voice was bright but brittle, holding herself together with pure will. I'll be right there, I said. After hanging up, I looked at Brandon's father. Will you be able to do this? When the moment comes. He met my eyes, and I saw a father's anguish there. I've already lost my son to his choices. I won't let him destroy your daughter too. My phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. The truth about Brandon. Reception. Be ready. No signature. No details. Just those 6 words that could mean anything or everything. The ceremony passed in a blur of forced smiles and mechanical movements. I walked my daughter down the aisle, her arm tight on mine like she was holding herself up, rather than letting me escort her. The church was packed with Brandon's people on one side, our family and friends on the other, like armies gathered for battle. When the minister asked who gave this woman to be married, I said the traditional words, but they tasted like ash. Brandon took her hand with that triumphant smirk, already counting his winnings. The vows sounded hollow, especially his promises to honor and cherish. Sarah's voice was barely audible when she repeated hers, like she was speaking from the bottom of a well. The reception began with the usual rituals: first dance, cake cutting, toasts from people who didn't know they were celebrating a lie. The Marriott ballroom glittered with those fairy lights my daughter had originally called excessive. I'd been standing near the bar, watching Brandon's father position himself behind a cluster of guests near the back exit when Brandon called out across the room. "Time for the family table! Your seat's waiting!" He stood behind my chair, that practiced smile showing too many teeth. The crowd naturally formed a semicircle, phones already out, everyone ready for whatever performance was coming. I walked slowly, playing my part, knowing what was coming but not how to stop it without causing the very scene that would destroy my daughter. "Let me get that for you, sir," Brandon said, his hand on the chair back, projecting his voice like an actor hitting his mark. The word "sir" dripped with a decade of resentment. I nodded, starting to lower myself, already bracing for the fall. The chair yanked backward, my body committed to sitting, gravity taking over. But this time, as I fell, everything seemed clearer, like watching a film I'd seen before. The floor rushed up, marble hard against my hip, the impact jarring but expected. "Your place is on the floor," Brandon announced, his laughter encouraging others to join. But before the laughter could build, a voice cut through like a blade. "Brad?" The older man from the bar had moved faster than I'd expected, pushing through the crowd. "Brad Miller, is that you?" The laughter died instantly, replaced by confused murmuring. Brandon's face went white, then red, cycling through emotions like a broken traffic light. The ballroom fell into complete silence. Even the servers froze mid-pour, champagne bottles suspended over glasses. "Dad?" The word escaped Brandon before he could stop it, confirming everything. The older man reached down to help me up, his face a mask of controlled fury and shame. "I'm so sorry. For all of it." Then he turned to the crowd, his voice commanding attention. "This man is not Brandon Mitchell. He's Brandon Miller, my son." The room seemed to hold its breath. Someone dropped a fork, the metallic clatter echoing like a gunshot. He was terminated from Cascade Investments 10 years ago for fraud. The man on the floor was the CEO who chose not to press charges, showed mercy. And this is how Brandon repays that mercy. Sarah stood frozen in her wedding dress, her face cycling through confusion, realization, and horror. "Brandon?" she said, the name foreign on her lips. "Your name is Brandon? Your father is alive?" Brandon tried to reach for her, but she stepped back sharply. "Don't touch me." Her voice was finding strength, sounding like herself again. Without a word, she pulled off her wedding ring and set it on the table with a decisive click that seemed to echo through the silent ballroom. "You want the truth?" the older man said, addressing the room but looking at his son. "Brandon has a history of this. Fraud, identity theft, targeting families he believes wronged him. There have been others. Not marriages, but relationships that ended with money missing, families broken." The crowd was recording everything now. Phones held high, the modern instinct to document drama overriding shock. Brandon's composure finally cracked completely. "You're doing this to me?" he screamed at his father. "Your own son?" His father's face was stone. "You did this to yourself, Brandon. 10 years of cons, of hurting people. It ends today." The ballroom doors opened, and hotel security entered, having been alerted by the disturbance. "We've called the police," one of them announced. "They're on their way." As security moved to contain Brandon, he turned back, his mask completely gone, revealing something ugly and desperate underneath. "This isn't over," he said, looking at me. "You ruined my life. You all did." But his words had no power now. Just the empty threats of a con man whose mark had finally seen through the illusion. Sarah walked to the microphone the band had abandoned. "Thank you all for being here," she said simply. "You've witnessed the truth winning over deception. That's worth more than any wedding." She stepped away from the microphone. No long explanation needed. The room began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with genuine warmth. Not for a wedding, but for survival. For truth winning over lies. The ballroom slowly emptied as guests processed what they'd witnessed, some offering my daughter awkward hugs, others slipping out quietly as if fraud might be contagious. The abandoned reception looked like a crime scene frozen in time. Half-eaten dinners sat cooling on plates, lipstick marks on champagne flutes that would never be raised in toasts, centerpieces wilting under the harsh ballroom lights that nobody had thought to dim. Hotel security had Brandon in the lobby, his protests echoing through the marble corridors as they waited for local police to arrive. Through the tall windows, I could see wedding guests clustered in the parking lot, their formal wear incongruous in the afternoon sun, everyone on their phones either calling for rides or posting about what they'd just witnessed. My ex-wife pushed through the remaining crowd with her new husband, her face cycling through emotions I hadn't seen in years. Concern, guilt, anger, but not the usual hostility she'd worn like armor since our divorce. Her makeup had run slightly, creating shadows under her eyes that made her look older, more vulnerable. "We need to talk," she said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in a decade. She looked at me without that defensive wall she'd built, then at our daughter, still in her wedding dress that now seemed like a costume from a play that had ended badly. All of us, as a family. We found ourselves in a small conference room off the ballroom, the kind hotels use for corporate breakout sessions, now serving as a refuge for a family trying to make sense of what just happened. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright after the soft wedding lighting. Through the doorway, I could see hotel staff beginning to dismantle the reception, moving with the efficient detachment of people who'd seen plenty of wedding disasters. They folded chairs and stacked them on carts, pulled down decorations that had witnessed such unexpected drama, packed away the dream that had turned into a nightmare. "How long did you know?" my ex asked, but her accusation lacked its usual bite. She sat down heavily in one of the conference chairs, her designer dress spreading around her like spilled wine. Her husband stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, clearly out of his depth but trying to be supportive. "I didn't know. I suspected," I said, choosing my words carefully. Something felt wrong from the beginning, the way he isolated her, the financial manipulation. But I thought I was being an overprotective father. Sarah sat between us, still in her wedding dress, the elaborate beading catching the harsh overhead lights in a way that seemed almost mocking. The dress had cost $8,000. Brandon had insisted on the designer, and now it would never be worn again. She looked younger than her 28 years, more like the teenager who'd cried in my arms during our divorce proceedings, confused and hurt by her parents' inability to stay together. "He had an answer for everything," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from crying or shock or both. Every concern Dad raised, Brandon explained it away. Made me think Dad was jealous, trying to control me like Mom said he did during the marriage. My ex flinched at that, her hand reaching reflexively for her husband's hand. The gesture was automatic, seeking comfort, but also acknowledging a wound she'd helped create. "I did say that," she admitted finally, the words seeming to physically hurt her. "I was angry, hurt, and I wanted you to choose sides. I wanted to win. I made your father a villain because it was easier than admitting we just grew apart, that sometimes love isn't enough." She looked at me directly for the first time in years. "I gave Brandon the blueprint for manipulating our daughter. I showed him exactly which buttons to push, which wounds were still raw." The confession hung in the air between us, heavy as the humid Atlanta afternoon pressing against the windows. Sarah looked between us, seeing her parents clearly, maybe for the first time. Not as the warring factions of her childhood, but as flawed people who'd made mistakes that had consequences neither of us had foreseen. The silence stretched until the maid of honor knocked and entered, carrying my daughter's phone and purse, the small beaded clutch that matched the dress that would now go unworn. Brandon's father appeared in the doorway, and I was struck again by how much he'd aged in just the few hours since our conversation at the bar. His expensive suit was rumpled, his silver hair disheveled, and his hands shook slightly as he entered. He looked like a man attending his own funeral, which, in a way, he was. The death of the illusion that his son could be saved, that love and money and second chances could fix what was fundamentally broken. "The police want to talk to you," he said to my daughter, his voice barely above a whisper. "They need a statement about the fraud, the false identity." He pulled out his phone with trembling fingers, showing us what he'd been collecting. Photos Brandon had taken of my daughter over months, maybe years. Her at her coffee shop on Tuesday mornings, at the museum where she worked, jogging the same route in Piedmont Park every weekend. The images were taken from a distance, but with clear intent, a predator studying his prey. "He studied you for 2 years, Brandon's father continued, each word seeming to cost him something. "Your coffee preferences, your favorite books, your insecurities about the divorce. He researched your interests, memorized your routines, learned your vulnerabilities. He didn't fall in love with you. He performed a character designed specifically to make you fall in love with him." The clinical nature of it, the reduction of romance to reconnaissance, made my daughter physically recoil. The maid of honor, who'd been standing quietly by the door, finally spoke up. "The video's everywhere," she said, holding up her own phone. "Someone live-streamed the whole thing. The chair pull, the revelation, everything." She showed us the screen where the video already had 2 million views and climbing. The comments section was a flood of support and shared experiences. People were calling my daughter brave, sharing their own stories about being conned, thanking her for the unintentional public service announcement about relationship fraud. "At least I never filed the marriage license," my daughter said, pulling off her veil and setting it on the conference table where it lay like a discarded spider web. Thank God for instincts. The relief in the room was palpable, a small mercy in an ocean of deception. No legal marriage meant no divorce proceedings, no annulment paperwork, no formal untangling beyond the emotional wreckage. She looked at the ring she'd already removed, a 3-carat diamond that Brandon had probably bought with someone else's money, and set it down next to the veil. My ex-wife's husband, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat. "The practical matters," he said in his lawyer voice, though he did corporate law, not family law. The deposits, the honeymoon, the gifts. There's probably $50,000 to sort through. Sarah laughed, but it was hollow, edged with hysteria. $50,000 for a lie. At least Dad's money bought the truth in the end. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with sudden purpose. I'm starting a blog tonight. About all of it. The red flags I ignored, the isolation tactics, how he weaponized my parents' divorce. If even one person recognizes these patterns and gets out, then something good comes from this disaster. I walked to the window, while they discussed logistics, looked out at the reception hall being systematically erased. The wedding cake stood untouched on its table, 3 tiers of perfect white frosting that would never be cut. The bride and groom figurines on top still smiling at each other in permanent plastic happiness. They didn't know their wedding was a fraud, that the groom was being questioned by police, that the bride was in a conference room planning a blog about surviving emotional manipulation. Someone had left a champagne flute on the windowsill, and I watched the bubbles still rising to the surface, refusing to accept the party was over. These inanimate objects had more faith in the celebration than any of us had left. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the abandoned reception hall. In a few hours, this space would be reset for another event, another celebration, another chance for joy or disaster. The chairs Brandon had so carefully arranged to humiliate me would be stacked and stored. The table where he'd pulled my chair would host another family's gathering. The marble floor where I'd fallen would be polished clean of today's shame and revelation. But we would carry this day with us, not as a wound, but eventually, hopefully, as wisdom. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee. Morning sun streaming through windows I'd finally gotten around to cleaning. The house felt different now, lighter somehow, like we'd exorcised ghosts we didn't know were haunting us. The coffee maker gurgled its familiar morning song, a sound that had become meditative in these months of rebuilding. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter, the custom ringtone I'd set for her playing that silly song she'd loved as a kid, something about butterflies and dreams that used to make her giggle uncontrollably. Check your mail. The real one, not email. And don't worry, it's good news this time. In my mailbox, nestled between bills and grocery store circulars that I'd never read, was a simple white envelope. No return address, but I recognized the lavender paper she'd always used for important things since middle school. Her handwriting hadn't changed much over the years. Still that careful cursive her third-grade teacher had insisted on, each letter formed with deliberate precision. Inside was a save-the-date card, deliberately simple, just black text on cream cardstock. No elaborate fonts, no gold foil, no corporate wedding aesthetic. Just my daughter's name and Marcus Brown, requesting the honor of my presence at their wedding next spring. Marcus Brown, her boyfriend from before Brandon, the one she'd dated for 2 years before Brandon appeared with his calculated charm and designer everything. Marcus, who worked as a physical therapist, who brought her lunch at the museum on Tuesdays, who had helped her move apartments 3 times without complaint. The one Brandon had convinced her was settling, playing it safe, not ambitious enough for the life Brandon was painting in broad, expensive strokes. Marcus, who wore the same jacket for 5 years and drove a Honda with 200,000 miles on it, and thought fancy meant the Thai place that gave you cloth napkins. She called while I was still holding the card, probably watching from her apartment window for the mail carrier, like she used to watch for the tooth fairy, that mix of skepticism and hope that characterized so much of her childhood. I could picture her in her small kitchen, the one with the temperamental stove and the window that looked out on a brick wall, pacing while she dialed, rehearsing what she wanted to say. "Before you say anything," she started, words tumbling over each other in that way she had when she was nervous but excited, like when she'd gotten into her first-choice college or landed the museum job. Marcus and I have been talking since everything happened. He saw the news coverage, everyone did. The video went viral. He reached out just to make sure I was okay. No agenda, no "I told you so," even though he'd tried to warn me about Brandon. Just a simple text. "Saw what happened. You okay? Here if you need anything." We started meeting for coffee, she continued, and I could hear her moving around her apartment, probably stress cleaning while talking, another habit from childhood when difficult conversations required movement. Just as friends at first. Wednesday mornings at that place near the museum. You know, the one with the terrible music but amazing croissants. He never once said, "I told you so," about Brandon, even though he'd seen the red flags I missed. The isolation tactics, the financial manipulation, the way Brandon always had to be the smartest person in the room. Marcus said love makes us vulnerable to believing the best about the worst people. He said it wasn't my fault for trusting, it was Brandon's fault for betraying that trust. "We're taking it slow," she added, and I could hear the smile in her voice, the real one, not the performed one she'd worn during the Brandon months. Both in therapy, individuals and couples. "Dr. Morrison, you'd like her. She has this office with too many plants and a coffee table made from reclaimed wood, and she doesn't let either of us get away with easy answers. We're making sure we're healing right before making commitments, learning to recognize our patterns, the wounds we carry from family stuff. But Dad, Marcus makes me feel like myself again. Not a better version or a different version, just me. And after everything with Brandon, that feels revolutionary. The wedding, when it came a year after the Brandon disaster, was everything the first wasn't. 40 people in Piedmont Park on a Saturday afternoon in April, the dogwoods in full bloom dropping pink petals like nature's own confetti. The same spot where I'd taught her to ride a bike 23 years earlier, where she'd fallen so many times her knees looked like a geography map of scrapes and bruises. She'd cried from frustration that day, thrown the bike down and declared she'd never learn. But she got back on. She always got back on. Marcus's family ran a restaurant in Decatur, authentic Szechuan, that had been there for 30 years, the kind of place where the menus were laminated and torn at the corners, and the owner knew everyone's order. They'd closed it for the day, to cater the reception themselves, his mother and aunts arriving at dawn with coolers and woks and industrial-sized rice cookers. His mother had spent weeks planning the menu with my daughter, teaching her to fold dumplings in her restaurant kitchen after closing time, sharing recipes that had never been written down, passed from hand to hand like sacred texts. No wedding planner directing every moment like a film production. No coordinated color schemes that meant nothing to anyone. No seating charts designed to impress people they'd never see again. Just families coming together over food that meant something. Recipes with stories. Dishes that carried memory. Sarah wore a simple dress she'd bought with the maid of honor at a consignment shop in Virginia Highlands, laughing that it cost less than one of the flower arrangements from the wedding that wasn't. "It's from the 1970s, she'd told me, spinning in my living room to show the vintage lace, the way the skirt moved like water. Some other bride was happy in this dress. Maybe that happiness stuck around, like the smell of perfume in an old purse. "You know what I learned?" my daughter said during our father-daughter dance. The park pavilion strung with lights Marcus's sisters had hung that morning. They'd stood on ladders while their kids ran around beneath them, handing out string lights and laughing when birds tried to steal the bulbs. Love shouldn't require you to disappear. It shouldn't make you smaller or quieter or less yourself. Brandon made me think love meant choosing him over everyone else, cutting ties, burning bridges for the privilege of being chosen by him. Marcus shows me love means building bridges, creating connections, weaving families together like those string lights, each bulb making the whole thing brighter. The toast Marcus gave made everyone cry, even his typically stoic father, who'd survived things he never talked about and measured emotions in teaspoons. Marcus stood there in his rented suit, the one that was a little too big in the shoulders, holding note cards he'd written and rewritten but ended up ignoring. Sarah came back into my life carrying weight that wasn't hers to carry, he said, his voice steady but emotional, the voice of someone who'd practiced this in his car, in the shower, in front of his bathroom mirror. Shame about being conned, guilt about hurting her family, fear about trusting again. But she faced all of it head on, publicly, bravely. She turned her worst moment into a teaching moment for thousands of others through her writing. The blog she started has helped hundreds of people recognize manipulation in their own relationships. That's the woman I fell in love with years ago, and that's the woman I'm honored to marry today. My ex-wife attended with her husband, and for the first time since our divorce 15 years ago, we could sit at the same table without that underlying tension that used to make family gatherings feel like negotiations between hostile nations. She'd started therapy after the Brandon incident, working through her own patterns of manipulation and blame with someone who specialized in family dynamics and the ripple effects of divorce. I taught our daughter to accept someone diminishing her, she'd admitted during a family session our daughter had asked us both to attend. The therapist's office smelled like vanilla candles and had too many throw pillows, neutral territory where we could say things we'd been choking on for years. I modeled it by diminishing you, making you the villain of our story instead of admitting we just grew apart, that we wanted different things, that neither of us was wrong. The story I told myself was easier than the truth, but it hurt our daughter. Brandon's father sent a letter my daughter let me read, his handwriting shaky but determined, the penmanship of someone who'd learned cursive in a different era and still believed in its formality. He was using his retirement funds, the money he'd saved for comfortable golden years of golf and cruises, to establish a foundation for fraud victims, particularly those targeted by romance scams. I can't undo what Brandon did, he wrote, but I can try to balance the scales. I've been working with victim advocacy groups, sharing Brandon's methods as a case study in predatory behavior. Every family has the capacity for both good and evil. The shame isn't in producing a Brandon. The shame would be in not trying to repair the damage, in letting his darkness be the final word. Brandon himself had taken a plea deal after 3 months of legal maneuvering, his public defender arguing for mental health considerations that the prosecutor systematically dismantled with evidence of premeditation and pattern behavior. 20 years with possibility of parole in 15, though the prosecutor said he'd likely serve the full term, given the severity and calculated nature of his crimes. Sarah had connected with his other victims through victim services, creating a support group that met monthly over video chat, women from different cities united by shared experience. 3 months after the wedding, my daughter texted me a photo from their honeymoon, a camping trip to the Smoky Mountains that cost less than the rehearsal dinner for the wedding that wasn't. She and Marcus were sitting by a fire, both looking at the camera with unguarded happiness, their faces dirty from hiking, their smiles genuine. No staged poses with perfect lighting calculated to generate social media envy. No performance of happiness for an audience that didn't exist. Just 2 people comfortable in their own skins and with each other. This is what real looks like, she'd written. Not perfect, not performed, just real. We saw a bear today, and Marcus tried to protect me by standing in front of me with a stick the size of a pencil. The bear just looked at us like we were idiots and wandered off. We laughed until we cried. That's marriage, right? Facing bears together with inadequate sticks, but feeling safe anyway, because you're together. My hip still aches when it rains. The ghost of that fall, a permanent reminder that probably should have healed better but didn't, because I'm too stubborn to do physical therapy properly. But I've reframed it, as the therapist I finally agreed to see suggested. It's not a symbol of humiliation anymore. It's proof of survival. Evidence that we can fall in the most public, devastating ways and still rise. That we can be targeted by predators and still choose to trust again. Carefully, with wisdom earned through pain. That our place in the world isn't determined by those who try to pull the ground out from under us, but by those who help us stand back up. If you've ever had someone try to pull the ground out from under you, if you've ever been made to feel like your place is beneath others, I want you to know something. What would you have done if someone pulled your chair? How would you have risen? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing.